Welcome to the Toyota Solutions Studio. I'm Stephanie Tsai, and my next guest has bore witness to some really terrible atrocities on an offshore island off Australia. Her name is Alanna Maycock. She is, by profession, a clinical nurse consultant, but a lot of what she has been doing is advising on refugee services in Australia. Alanna, thank you so much for coming into the Toyota Solutions studio. And I do want to get to solutions because I think that's so important. But first, I'm so curious how you even found yourself on this island. It's called Nauru, and journalists haven't been able to get on it. Other health professionals haven't been able to get there. How did you find yourself there?
That's very good question. So, because of our work in the clinic in the Children's Hospital in Sydney, there's a health service provider that are responsible for providing health services on the islands and in Australia's detention centres. Their contract's worth $1.6 billion a year. They also provide healthcare services to a section of asylum seekers in the community. Some of those asylum seekers are referred to our clinic.
Okay.
So the directors from IHMS got in touch with us and asked us if we would be prepared to go to Nauru and consult on some of the children there and write recommendations for IHMS and the government on how they can improve services there.
Okay.
So when they first asked, we didn't feel that we wanted to go because we felt we would be complicit in the system if we went there. But we talked about it and we actually thought, if we do go, we can become better advocates by seeing it with our own eyes.
Because you already knew at that point that there were abuses happening, that there were conditions that were abhorrent there. Okay, so that's what you mean by saying complicit.
Saying complicit, exactly.
And what did you find when you got there?
So we decided to go, and I think we all knew that we were going to see atrocities, like you've said, but I don't think anything prepares you for actually witnessing child abuse and abuse of their parents in front of your own eyes. And that is what you see when you go to Nauru Detention Centre. You see guards, cleaners, healthcare professionals, all complicit really in child abuse. So what we saw when we went there was one of the mothers that I met had been menstruating for 2 months. She'd had no referral to a doctor. She was using material from her tent to hold the bleeding.
Oh, God.
And as she was walking to the toilet, now her toilet block was 120 metres away from the toilet, and there are male guards sitting outside the toilets. So one night she decided to brave that dark walk through the camp, past the male guards to reach the toilets, and a blood clot fell from her, and blood trailed behind her as she went to the toilet. Another mother I met was bedwetting. So she was too frightened to go to the toilet because of the assaults and rapes that were happening on the island. So she was wetting the bed. Not in my 20 years of being a nurse have I ever met a mother that is bedwetting because she's too scared to go to the toilet or too traumatized.
So let me stop you there and just, because you bring up a lot of things just in those two anecdotes. One, do the women not have access to basic essentials like sanitary napkins? That's number one. Number two, are there doctors on the island that could have provided health care to these women? Are there, and then in the second case, are there psychologists that can treat these refugees, many of whom I understand come by boat, so may be already traumatized by the time they get to the island? Do those things exist there?
So there was no free access to sanitary products when I was there. I asked the doctors on the island numerous times, could they please get me some sanitary products to give to these women? And I was dismissed. And yes, there is healthcare on the island, but the medical centre is 4 kilometres away from the actual camp. So logistically, it's a problem for them to access healthcare.
That's 2 miles.
It's 2 miles, but it's not just the distance, it's the logistics. These women and families, they can't just hop on a bus and go and see a doctor, right? They're in a camp.
Yeah, they don't have cars.
No, they don't have cars, they don't have buses. You're on a remote island. This island has been deliberately chosen because of its remote location. So logistically, it's very, very difficult. For them to access a doctor, they have to give a slip of paper to a Save the Children worker. The Save the Children worker will give it to the healthcare provider, which will then book them an appointment. Half the time that ticket gets lost, the appointment's not booked, they're not taken from the camp to the medical centre. And when they are taken from the camp to the medical centre, they have to wait hours and hours to see a healthcare worker. And as regards psychologists, the question you asked me about psychologists, we met one woman that had been raped on the island, and she wept and cried her eyes out as she told me that she'd been raped. And we referred this lady to a psychologist on the island, and the psychologist turned around and said to me afterwards, why did she not cry out? She was wearing provocative clothing. Now, she was wearing a pair of shorts and a tank top, a tank vest,
right,
that I wear in the Australian summer in the 40-degree heat.
We all would, yeah.
It reaches 50 degrees on Nauru Island. There's no shade, there's no trees.
Right.
It's absolutely scorching hot. It's in the middle of a decimated phosphate mine. And then people would say to me, so how do you know that this is true? You weren't there when she was raped. And that's true. I wasn't there when she was raped. The doctor that I was with wasn't there when she was raped. But when you have women that are showering in front of male guards, because there's no doors on the showers, there's only a flimsy curtain. When you have women washing themselves and their babies naked in showers 7 to 10 metres away from men, you can see how women are placed in really vulnerable situations. You can see how things like this are possible.
As you're describing all of these things, it just sounds like a big knot of so many problems. There are issues with law enforcement, recourse that women that are rape victims have, healthcare, and then you think about the children being exposed to all this and the trauma. I want to get to what you saw as the solution. So you saw all of that, and you've been labeled sort of a whistleblower now. You came back and you talked about it, and from my understanding, you had to break a contract just to do that.
Law.
So what have you been doing? Who have you been talking to get some attention on what's happening there and change policy?
So one of the reasons that we're here and that we've agreed to come to this conference is because the world does not know what is happening. Okay, and the reason that we've come here is because this is drawing international attention to this issue. We've got Australia 100% funding a detention centre on a remote island where child abuse is happening. It's been reported to the Australian government, they've seen the research, and they are continuing to allow children to remain on an island where there's no child protection framework. So Nauru has no child protection framework in the same way that we do in Australia. If an Australian child or any child in Australia is in an Australian-run facility and the healthcare workers feel that they are at harm in some way, they're at risk of harm, we would remove them from that situation pending investigation.
But you can't do that on this island.
You cannot do that on Nauru.
So it's legal, basically, to detain the children.
Well, it's not legal because they're not abiding by international law. But as I said, there is no child protection framework there. So in Nauru, if a child is at risk, they have to face their perpetrator day in, day out, and the parents cannot remove their child from that danger. So can you imagine being a parent in that situation when you know that your child has been harmed and you cannot remove them from that harm?
You must feel completely helpless.
So what alternative do you have than to report this? So it's ingrained in you from the minute you start your healthcare training that if you feel that your patients are at harm or at risk, you have to report it. But the reporting structures are not there. They are not there. You report the abuse to the IHMS directors. The IHMS directors may or may not report it to the government, but the government are the ones that are putting them there. So it's almost a license for guards, cleaners, other personnel to behave as inappropriately as they wish.
Yeah, there's no accountability.
There's no repercussions for their actions. Because they know that the Australian government doesn't want them. So that's almost a license for them to behave how they want to behave.
I can't believe that the Australian media isn't all over this story. Has that led to discussions in the legislative branch and the executive branch in your country?
We know that there have been job cuts, or there's threats of job cuts in certain media streams for publishing our work.
People are being fired for
getting
this out there?
Yes. So not only has the government brought out a law to put people like me in jail for reporting sexual abuse on children, child abuse on children, they've also threatened certain media branches in Australia with job cuts. So you have a complete shroud of secrecy. The media are not allowed on the island. It costs them $8,000 to apply for a visa, for a journalist to apply for a visa on Nauru, and 99% of the time that gets rejected.
Yeah.
So when you have a system that's exempt from the media, exempt from public scrutiny, you have a system that's completely open to abuse, open to mistreatment.
Yeah.
And the people might say that why aren't the Australian people doing anything about this?
Right.
They don't know. The same way that the world doesn't know about this issue. It's not getting out there. The media are not allowed on the island.
Yeah.
The media are being threatened by the government, as are we, and the information is not being fed.
It sounds like the hope really lies with people like you at this point, the few people that have seen it and that have been willing to speak up about it.
Yeah, and it's, ultimately you have a duty of care to your patients. When you begin training, you learn about your ethical code of conduct and your mandatory reporting obligations. If I don't report child abuse at work, I will be disciplined.
Yeah.
If I report child abuse in an Australian-run detention centre, I could have gone to jail. Now, excuse me, Malcolm Turnbull and the government in Australia, but that's slightly confusing for me. Yeah. But what option do you have? You keep silent? You keep silent about sexual abuse and physical abuse on children? Is that where we're at? Is that the right thing to do? It just wasn't an option for me.
Yeah. Well, it's so important that you continue to raise your voice on this issue, and you've certainly been heard here at the Women in the World Summit, where there are a lot of influential journalists and women in power, and hopefully it will lead to the change that you seek.
Thank you.
Thank
you for having me.
Thanks for joining us.